A little while back, I was browsing through some YouTube videos of weird and ridiculous commercials when I happened upon this little gem. It's a cautionary tale, you might say, the story of what happens when you take a cast member of Boy Meets World and drop him in with the cast of Dangerous Minds. See, Ryder Strong over here is on his way to have him malted with his best gal or some damn thing, when a pack of godless ruffians descends upon him, demanding that they give him his father's guitar. One of the more multicultural street gangs I've ever seen brings out every weapon you'd expect from ruthless thugs of their caliber. A switchblade, brass knuckles, nunchucks... Nunchucks? Okay. But even that choice of weapon isn't nearly as absurd as what happens next. What is this commercial for? I need to know immediately. What is this selling? Is there some sort of new Christian guitar company out there? Because if I'm being honest, this is the exact kind of shit that classic rock loved pulling in the 80s. So what is this for? Oh my God. There was a Left Behind video game? How did I miss that? How did that even happen? For those of you who don't know, Left Behind was a series of books that tells the story of the world post-rapture. All the good Christians get taken into heaven, the Antichrist takes over, and then Jesus comes back to defeat the devil, and we find out in the end that he was Kaiser Sose all along. Oh, sorry. Spoilers. The books were not what you would call good. Unless you saw the movies based on them, in which case they read like William Shakespeare. And now you're telling me there's a game based on this franchise? Oh no. This is bad. Like asset flip 99-cent game on Steam bad. I can't help but feel like if I were a Christian gamer, this sort of thing would feel deeply insulting. Which got me to thinking, have there been any good Christian games? The games industry has been around for decades, and Christianity has been around for, well, longer. So one would think that Christianity would have made its BioShock or its Super Mario Bros. By now. So I started digging, and what I found was a history that is fascinating in its twists and turns over the years. Welcome back to Geek History, a show where we tackle subjects with the diligence of a paladin, the seriousness of a cleric, and the sarcasm of a weird pagan warlock. Today's topic is on the history of Christian video games. Where did they start, and where did they end up? Like all topics worth their salt, you have to start in the 80s. 1982 was a pretty big year in the history of video games. You had your Donkey Kong Jr., you had Pitfall, you had Ultima 2, you had E.T., and on a smaller scale, you had the founding of BibleBytes, a computer game and programming company founded by the Conrad family. In '82, they released a collection of Christian-based computer games for the TRS-80 color computer. These games were basic, to say the least, even for a TRS-80, and had names like the Exodus game, Heavenly Mansions, Church Growth game, and the Rapture game. A year later, BibleBytes released a book that contained the code for those games, along with a tutorial on how to program them yourself, and that to me was the coolest thing about what BibleBytes had to offer. They're showing you their games in a format that could get you started in a basic understanding of coding. The games you learned to code weren't what you'd call state-of-the-art, but we all have to start somewhere. In fact, I was most surprised to find out that BibleBytes still exists to this day, and has continued to create coding tutorials all centered around Bible games. They market pretty heavily to the homeschool community, which, again, I like. There are public schools out there that don't teach you anything about coding. Their tutorials go up about as far as Java, and again, you're looking at some pretty rudimentary stuff, but hey, any community that wants to teach their kids how to program games is alright by me. In 1983, Red Sea Crossing was released for the Atari 2600. It's considered the first Christian console game out there, even though for a long time, some people thought that it didn't even exist. This comes from the fact that it is basically impossible to find. The programmer, Steve Shustak, claims that only about 500 copies of the games were made, and it received little to no marketing. If you happen to have a copy collecting dust in your closet, I'd recommend making a trip to this little-known site called eBay, because the last time one of these games was discovered, it sold online for over $10,000. That's how rare this thing is. The game itself is a side-scrolling platformer, ostensibly based on Moses crossing the Red Sea. Yes, apparently after getting God to part the Red Sea, Moses' troubles weren't quite over just yet. He still had to dodge Roman spears and jump over snakes on the way to the other side. It's sort of odd. Outside the title of the game and the sprite's little shepherd crook there's really no indication to suggest that this is a game founded on religion. Or anything, for that matter. Now, beyond a few other outliers, smaller teams like BibleBytes and Steve Shustak were sort of the only designers in town as far as Christian video gaming was concerned for pretty much the entirety of the 80s, and even then, they're barely a blip on the radar of any discussion on religious games on a grand scale. And there's a very good reason for that. They were overshadowed a little bit. Overshadowed by something that came about in 1991.
Do you ever worry that they're playing too much Nintendo?
Oh, not anymore. See, Matt has Bible adventures. They're actually learning Bible stories while they're playing Nintendo.
Quick, get that Bible quote before you run out of power.
Bible Adventures features 3 games in 1 cartridge: Noah's Ark, Save Baby Moses, and David and Goliath. A must for every family with Nintendo. Call 1-877-BIBLE. That's 1-877-BIBLE.
Wisdom Tree. If I had to guess, I'd say that the vast majority of gamers and gaming historians out there knew that me mentioning this one was inevitable. Wisdom Tree's games have been a topic for discussion and mockery all over the internet for about as long as gamers complaining on the World Wide Web has been a thing. Of all the Christian video game companies out there, I'd say that Wisdom Tree has the strangest history of them all. It started in 1988 with the founding of Color Dreams. Now, Color Dreams has a certain infamy in the history of Nintendo games because they were some of the first game developers to figure out how to get around the 10 NES lockout system. Essentially, Nintendo wanted to have complete control over who could and couldn't make games for them. If your game was too violent or broke any number of Nintendo's other rules, they wouldn't authorize your game. And the 10 NES lockout system was built into each and every Nintendo Entertainment System out there. If your game didn't send the appropriate signal to the lockout, signifying that your game was nice and kosher, it wouldn't play. Now, finding a workaround for the lockout system wasn't illegal, but if Nintendo found out that your toy store or game retailer was selling games that they didn't stamp their approval on, it would threaten to withhold its own merchandise until you stopped. Thus, people weren't exactly falling all over themselves trying to sell unlicensed games by Color Dreams. So why wouldn't Nintendo license Color Dreams games? Well, it could have been a lot of reasons. Nintendo wasn't fond of games that included too much sexuality, violent imagery, or child endangerment, but if you believe many of the people who have played those games, it might also have more to do with the idea that Color Dreams games sucked. Color Dreams made more unlicensed games for the NES than almost anyone, sometimes hitting 6 games a year, so there was definitely a fluctuation in quality, let's say. So, Color Dreams had gotten around the NES lockout, but retailers, fearing retribution from Nintendo, refused to stock the games. What Color Dreams did next was equal parts brilliant and cynically opportunistic. You see, starting back in the 70s, and some could argue even earlier, there was a boom in the market for Christian literature and entertainment. Books by Hal Lindsey and Billy Graham were at the top of the bestsellers lists, and as a result, Christian bookstores and retailers grew in response, and it didn't just end with books. This growth continued in a trend that led, in many ways, to the popularity of things like Christian rock, films, and television. Color Dreams saw this, and they hopped on that wave of sanctified wine with a new game and a severe rebranding. 1991 saw the release of Bible Adventures, a 3-in-1 game with gameplay based loosely on the stories of Noah, Moses, and David and Goliath. And with that game's release, Color Dreams took on a new name, the vaguely religious-sounding Wisdom Tree. That this game is remembered poorly by most is something of an understatement. Bible Adventures continues the slapdash trend of quick, low-quality games that Color Dreams had held onto for years, and it's a pretty consistent contender on worst games lists. But here's the problem. The plan worked. For as much of a cynical cash grab as the creation of Wisdom Tree was, they basically had the market cornered. I mean, sure, there were some other Christian games here and there, but for the most part, Wisdom Tree dominated the 90s. All of this despite the fact that the vast majority of designers and managers at Wisdom Tree weren't religious in the slightest, and sometimes were outspoken atheists. But this was the 90s. People didn't really care too much about who designed their games in those days. Over the course of several years, Wisdom Tree released many other games, none of which were ever licensed by Nintendo, by the way. By this time, Nintendo had already taken Tengen, another gaming company that worked its way around the lockout, to court twice. But I'm guessing Nintendo thought better of suing a small Christian game developer. It's not a good look. It's also important to note that the vast majority of these games were just reskins of games that Wisdom Tree had made back in the days when they were Color Dreams. Menace Beach became Sunday Funday, Crystal Mines became Exodus, and so on. It's one of the reasons that Wisdom Tree was able to crank out so many games in such a short amount of time. But how long can these sort of jaded business decisions satisfy a team of creative game developers, really? Dan Lawton, the founder of Wisdom Tree, decided he wanted to create something sinister and gruesome. Wolfenstein 3D was making the rounds at this point, and Lawton did exactly what you'd expect from a man who's made his fortune on the back of Christian video games. He purchased the rights to Hellraiser and decided he was going to make a gore-soaked shooter based on that, using Wolfenstein 3D's engine. Which would have been a tough sell at Lifeway, let me just say. By the time it became abundantly clear what a bad idea this was going to be for their public image, a little game called Doom was released. That fact, coupled with several other programming issues Wisdom Tree was having, made the decision for them. Let's just make another Noah's Ark game. Super 3D Noah's Ark ended up being just another Wolfenstein clone in a world full of Wolfenstein clones. You fire fruits at animals, and I guess that makes them sleepy enough that you can load them into the Ark? I don't know. Super 3D Noah's Ark was Wisdom Tree's first and last game for the Super Nintendo. It also stands out as being the only unlicensed commercial release for the SNES. In order to get around that system's lockout, you were required to plug the cartridge into an officially licensed SNES game, sort of like a Game Genie, which makes Super 3D Noah's Ark a main contender for my "Holy shit, look at the brass balls on these people" award. After that, Wisdom Tree sort of petered out. The founders were moving on to new projects, and eventually the company was taken over by members of the team that were actual Christians. It still exists today, although they mostly specialize in redistributing their old games. You can find a lot of them on Steam. Now, there's no question that Wisdom Tree is the biggest name in Christian games in the 90s, if not all time. But there were a couple of games that I think ought to be mentioned here for a few reasons. The first would have to be Noah's Ark, developed by Konami. Yeah, there was an officially licensed Nintendo game with a Christian theme. So how did Konami get to make a licensed Christian game when Wisdom Tree couldn't? Well, maybe because when I say that Noah's Ark had a Christian theme, I'm using that term very loosely. Konami's Noah's Ark seemed about as well informed on the subject of Noah and the flood as your average American is on the Rig Veda. There's a lot of flying, transmogrifying into fish, and Apaches for some reason. Wait, is he collecting yin-yangs? Okay. In 1994, Bridgestone Multimedia Group brought us Captain Bible! And if I'm being honest, this is the first game so far that isn't half bad. I mean, it isn't good. It's based around collecting Bible verses and interpreting them correctly, and its combat is clunky as hell, but there is combat with a real sword and everything, and the usage of the Bible verses isn't all that different from other games where you need to collect different pieces to a puzzle. You play as the titular captain who must enter a city encased in a dome of darkness by a race of robotic atheists who aim to deceive and destroy the faith of the citizenry. It isn't brilliant, and it does get pretty samey after a while, but I get the distinct impression that the designers of the game actually cared about making a Christian game that was, hear me out on this one, sort of fun. And after all those Wisdom Tree games, it's nice to come across a religious game that at least seems sincere. After that, you're largely looking at more Wisdom Tree games throughout the 90s, along with a King James Bible for the Game Boy, which hurts my eyes just to think about, and an empty little Doom clone called Saints of Virtue. And when I say empty, I mean empty. This game is about as full as a bottle of Jaeger in a frat house. And then we got to the new millennium, and that brought a doozy of a game. Catechumen was released in the year 2000. It was developed and published by Enlightening Software, an organization that would eventually go on to found the Christian Game Developers Association. Their CEO, Ralph Bagley, has been very outspoken in wanting to develop games that offer an alternative to purely violent blood and guts games. And I bring that up because, like Captain Bible before it, Catechumen is clearly trying to balance their Christian message with the best game that they could possibly make. In fact, it was that dedication that brought them their funding, since investors were keen to develop a less gore-soaked shooter game after the Columbine shootings brought a lot of unwanted attention to games like Doom. This investment ended up at the tune of over $800,000, making it the most expensive Christian game ever produced up to that point. Catechumen takes place during the Roman reign of Marcus Aurelius, an emperor who was pretty well known for his persecution of Christians. In those days, Romans who were converted to Christianity would take on a mentor and become known as a catechumen, or a pre-baptized student, thus the hardest game name to pronounce since... Wise? In this game, you play just such a student, and your mentor has been captured by demon-possessed Romans, so you have to go deeper and deeper into the catacombs, eventually entering hell itself to rescue your mentor. To do this, you'll collect ancient artifact weapons like the Staff of Moses and the Sword of Gabriel to defeat demons and eventually take on Satan himself. Now, I don't care what your religious affiliation happens to be, but we all have to agree, that sounds metal as hell.
That is the most metal thing I ever heard in my whole life. High five.
It's not a flawless game. The AI's pretty bad, and the graphics go from decent to very odd at moments. And it is a little strange that instead of killing a lot of your enemies, you are actually converting them to Christianity. Oh, did I not mention that? Yeah, that's the thing. But as far as FPS games go, if it weren't for little tidbits, like the fact that your health bar is actually a faith bar that you have to refill by finding scriptures, the idea that this is a Christian game might slip right past you. And maybe that's what the problem was. For your average Christian playing this, it might be a lot of fun, but I can imagine plenty of parents and pastors squinting their eyes and wondering just where the message of Jesus was in all of this. On the other hand, your more secular players might enjoy Catechumen to a certain extent, but in the previous year alone, we'd seen games like Unreal Tournament, Quake 3 Arena, and System Shock 2, and those are tough games to compete with. But there is something that Catechumen has that these other games simply do not. A hallelujah chorus every time you kill an enemy. Oh, sorry, I mean convert. In 2001, Enlightening followed Catechumen up with Ominous Horizons, A Paladin's Calling, a game in which you search the world for pieces of the Gutenberg Bible which has been stolen by, you guessed it, Satan. Your goal is to reassemble the sacred text and bring the gospel to the world. Enlightening spent $1.6 million on Ominous Horizons, doubling the amount they'd spent on Catechumen, and somehow the later game still looks worse. Ultimately, Ominous Horizons only sold 50,000 copies, and while in 2005 Ralph Bagley mentioned a new game entitled Ringo the Rolling Cherub, I have not been able to find it anywhere. Enlightening would eventually shut its doors in 2009, which is a shame. I really would have loved to play a game called Ringo the Rolling Cherub. For a few years after this, the most promising game one could find as a Christian would probably be Dance Praise, a Dance Dance Revolution ripoff that has you shaking your booty to Christian tunes. They made 4 of these games over the years, including 7 expansion packs. Just like DDR, there's an arcade mode and a battle mode. It really is basically indistinguishable from DDR, except for the fact that you're dancing to Christian music. Well, not quite that sort of Christian music. Overall, the games contained over 350 songs collectively, including bands that even some of us secular folks might recognize, from DC Talk and Reliant K to Jars of Clay. They even came out with a Guitar Hero ripoff called Guitar Praise in 2008, but not before 2006 brought... Oh, that's right. You think I forgot the date we came in with? Based on the best-selling novels, Left Behind: Eternal Forces is a real-time strategy game where you lead a team of Christians in post-rapture New York, converting those who will be saved and killing everyone else. Okay, alright, to be clear, you're meant to kill people as a last resort and you actually suffer penalties for doing so, but I think this is the first time in a Christian game where you even have the opportunity to murder non-believers. Even with all its demon fighting, Catechumen still only had you converting non-believers with your sword blasts. And people on both sides noticed. Aside from the fact that the game was largely panned for terrible graphics, AI, and just overall weak gameplay, there were more than a few organizations that took umbrage to what they saw as a convert or die narrative. It was 5 years after 9/11, and any use of the words crusade or convert left people a little jumpy. Oh, and when I say a few organizations didn't like where Left Behind was going, I'm not just talking about atheists and non-believers here, although they were definitely present. A number of Christian groups argued for a boycott of the game, claiming that this level of violence in a piece of Christian media is really inappropriate. And I sympathize. It's easy for bad representatives to set a narrative back, you know? We all have that one guy in our group or affiliation that makes us sigh and think, ugh, don't help me. And for a lot of these Christians, Left Behind: Eternal Forces was their version of that idiot next to the punch bowl who's taken one philosophy course and won't shut the fuck up. Even anti-video game activist and disbarred lawyer Jack Thompson came out against this game, saying, quote, "The game is about killing people for their lack of faith in Jesus. The gospel is not about killing people in the name of the Lord, and Jesus made that very clear." Are you happy, Left Behind? You made me agree with something Jack Thompson said. Jack Thompson! I gotta go wash my hands. There were a lot of things that were just odd about the Left Behind games and how they were handled beyond the killing stuff. Female characters weren't initially allowed to do certain jobs like building, I'm assuming because that's men's work. You can actually play as the forces of the Antichrist in the multiplayer, which must have had plenty of folks scratching their heads, considering the game's themes. The way that Left Behind games handled the controversy surrounding it was less than graceful, let's say. Now, there were a lot of rumors that swirled around this game. Rumors that act like a game of telephone. The game's focused around converting people to Christianity, people get to talking, and suddenly you hear from a friend who heard from a friend who heard from a friend that the game gives you points for killing Muslims. The first Left Behind game ended up bringing in $2 million total, which is not amazing. Left Behind was getting ready to release an expansion, but before they did that, they sent a message to game reviewers who had panned Eternal Forces. Like, literally, they sent a message from their lawyer. Websites like Gameology, Public Theologian, and The Daily Kos all reported receiving the same letter from the lawyers of Left Behind Games. It said that if their site did not remove any false and misleading statements that they may have made about the game in question, including any comments readers may have left to that effect, well, then, we'll see you in court. And that's tough, because they never specified exactly what those false and misleading statements might have been. As far as I could find out, they never pulled the trigger on this one, which probably makes a ton of sense. If you're already dealing with public relations issues, then suing bloggers isn't going to help your case very much. Left Behind Games would go on to claim in 2009 that the bad publicity may have cost them upwards to $200 million in shareholder value because of how low their stock plummeted during the bad publicity, but that didn't stop them from making 3 sequels to the game and releasing them in 2008, 10, and 11. Not long after that, the CEO of the company got fined for some shady stock deals, the company's stocks were suspended, and Left Behind Games has been quietly living on drip feed since then. Now that's about 29 years of games right there. Admittedly, it's a little abridged, but I think we've hit enough of the major points to sense some patterns here. For the most part, what we've seen is Christian developers take what's popular, add Bible verses, and create a shell of a game that they're trying to emulate, and sanitize it for their audience.
Billy Graham's Bible Blaster?
Keep firing! Convert the heathens!
Got him!
No, you just winged him and made him a Unitarian.
On one hand, it makes for safe, mediocre games. Unless you're a kid who got Catechumen for Christmas instead of System Shock 2, it's difficult to actually get upset or even pay too much attention to games like these. And just like Christian rock, your average gamer tends to look down their nose at Christian video games. Not necessarily because they're religious per se, but because of the consistently lousy quality of the games themselves. I am more than certain that if you gave hardcore gamers a badass spectacle fighter like Bayonetta, make it about the Bible, throw in all the verses you want, and just make sure that it's beautiful and fun, they're not gonna care about the spirituality all that much. So the problem with Christian games for the first 30 years of their lives tended to be that even when they had good intentions, they used a ton of tell and not a lot of show. Now, that isn't a weakness inherent to religion on the whole, and it's a problem we've seen with a ton of secular games. So why is it such a persistent issue with the Christian ones? If I had to guess, I'd say the answer lies either in caring too much or not at all. Take the renaissance of Christian movies we've been seeing in the past few years. These movies, a lot like early Christian video games, are generally critically panned for their story, for their structure, cinematography, and a laundry list of other sins that would make any filmmaker worth their salt cringe. So why don't the filmmakers work to eliminate those issues? Is it because they don't have any money? No, far from it. Filmmakers can't solve those issues because these movies generally aren't being made by filmmakers. They're being made by preachers.
There's 2 men named Alex and Stephen Kendrick. They make movies. Courageous, Facing the Giants, Fireproof. Whether you like their movies or not is not the point. These men are preachers. They are not filmmakers. They will tell you, I know them, I have worked with them. They will tell you, we are not here to make art. We are not here to make movies. We are here to build up the body and preach the gospel. We use film to do it.
When your first goal is anything other than to create the best game that you can, the game itself will suffer. So when the creators of games like Catechumen or Captain Bible set out to make their art, they're handicapped by the fact that they don't just want to make a great game, they want to make a great game that will educate and possibly even convert. This, if I'm being honest, is why general education games are often so mediocre. Their goal is something other than a purely enjoyable experience, and so the game itself suffers. The creators care so much about their message that they hobble the vehicle it's meant to ride on. Now, on the other hand, there are those who don't care at all, the most obvious being the Wisdom Tree series and, I believe, the Left Behind games. These are games that are being made purely as a money-making venture. They want to tap into a certain specialized audience, and so they research it, they market it, they slap a Christian fish on it.
And now you're selling it. You want to sell it. Well,
and then they hope they can see some guaranteed income from that demographic, regardless of the quality of what they're putting out. The problem itself is no big surprise. It's something that's been going on since the beginning of religion. Hucksters used to sell fake relics to naive pilgrims hundreds of years ago, and I guarantee you there was a guy selling fake Jesus water into Cabernet 5 minutes after the wedding at Cana ended. And I'd like to point out here that I'm not interested as a writer or a YouTuber or a human being in just flat out picking on Christians. I've got a pretty strict be kind and don't legislate your opinions and we're good rule. But these games... I've actually talked to several Christian gamers over the course of creating this video, trying to see if there's anything that I've missed out on, but no. The general consensus among them tends to be that up to a certain time period, these religious games were just flat out bad. So ultimately, what could save Christian games? The answer, it turns out, is the game industry itself. Just like filmmaking, game design has become more and more of a legitimate art as time has gone on. Video games went from simple Mario-centric platformers to thoughtful and relevant works of beauty and excitement, and the industry only got bigger and bigger as time went on. So we start to see games with biblical themes that focus on the experience and thus are just better games in the end. You had games like 2011's El Shaddai, Ascension of the Metatron, which is overtly based on apocryphal books of the Bible and involve you taking on fallen angels to prevent a great flood. In the same year, The Binding of Isaac came out, and while this game is infamously over the top in its gore and depictions of religious imagery, it still invited the player to think about religion and faith in a way that other games just hadn't. The indie boom itself has been rife with games that are asking questions and talking about faith in a way we've never seen before in this industry. We've got action Diablo clones like 5, Champions of Canaan, weird little RPGs like Flood the Prequel, and That Dragon Cancer, which to me stands out as the best game to ever tackle faith and the divine. It's not an easy game to play, that's for damn sure, but I've yet to see any game designers tackle religion this well. And that's to say nothing of games with a more vaguely spiritual feel, like Journey or Everything, which is based entirely around quotes by the philosopher Alan Watts. I think what we learned from the history of Christian video games is something that game designers and artists of every stripe can take to heart. That the best way to reach an audience beyond your current one is through showing and not telling. Telling someone that you want them to have a relationship with Jesus Christ, or any deity for that matter, isn't going to be nearly as effective as just walking the walk and enjoying your faith or spirituality or whatever. My guess is that even a strange game like El Shaddai, which is centered around loose interpretations of an esoteric book of the Bible, would be more effective of a conversion tool than a game that says, here's our religion's rules and you must follow each one of them, simply based on the fact that El Shaddai is pretty fun and might get someone kind of interested. The majority of the games I've mentioned in this video are just flat out bad, but things are clearly getting better for Christian games because games in general are getting better and more varied. A wealth of options is always more appealing, even when you have to sift through a ton of crap to find those diamonds. And I like that. There's plenty of room for both. Room for the religious to adore secular video games, and room for me to quietly fantasize that one day there will be an open-world RPG where you play Jesus Christ and level up your powers as you spread your message and eventually duke it out with Satan in an epic final boss level. I'd play the hell out of that game. And maybe it's a pipe dream, but I'm sure that that game would still do a hell of a lot better than Super Noah's Ark 3D.
Would you like to know more?
I was completely taken off guard by just how much material there is out there on this subject, despite the fact that I had trouble finding any actual fixed collection of it. First and foremost, the best book I read in my research for this topic would have to be Bible Adventures by Gabe Durham for Boss Fight Books. It goes into detail on Wisdom Tree that I couldn't possibly have fully covered in this video without making it 3 hours long. It's one part history and one part memoir, and Durham's insights into Bible adventures and Christian gaming in general is fascinating. Boss Fight Books is a great series in general. They cover a number of different games from different time periods, and they're always a lot of fun to read. After that, I take a look at the videos of YouTubers Big Joel and Josh Keefe. Both of them cover Christian filmmaking in great detail, as well as a number of other topics. And while Christian filmmaking, Christian video games are not exactly the same subject, they gave me a lot of insights that I found crossed over. Finally, I'd recommend having a look at Of Games and God by Kevin Shute. As both a Christian and a gamer, Shute offers some very interesting insights into balancing a life of religion and gaming. Thank you so much for watching. This is the beginning of what I'm going to call Season 2 of Geek History, and I certainly hope you enjoyed it. I've got some ideas for future episodes, but as always, I'd love to hear what you'd like to see me cover in the future, so let me know in the comments. And if you could like and hit that subscribe button, it would mean a ton to me. I've also opened up a Patreon account for those of you who would like to help me make these. As you may have guessed, these videos take a long time, and any support you can offer would make the creation of them that much easier on me. It is not required by any stretch of the imagination, but you'd have my unending thanks. The link is in the description, and thanks again for watching.
If Daddy don't sink a little drinky, Daddy gets sad and blue. Sneak a little drinky, sneakity-doo. Sneak a little drinky past you. Sneak a little drinky, sneakity-doo. Sneak a little drinky past you.